All right, I'd like to introduce Leon Compton to you, who's going to basically facilitate the panel discussion we've got next. Leon joined ABC Radio Hobart in 2011 as the presenter on Statewide mornings covering local current affairs and events. He's previously worked with ABC Radio in the Northern Territory, Victoria and New South Wales. Leon began his career at the ABC in 2001 as a breakfast presenter on ABC Western Victoria after a 2-year stint in commercial radio. His first day at the ABC was marked by comprehensively bogging the work car in Lake Hindmarsh. And I did ask him the story, it's actually quite interesting. So on that note, I'll leave you with Leon.
Hey, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I am really excited. Of all the many people that we've spoken to on the ABC Mornings program this week, I haven't been as excited about talking to our panellists this afternoon. So I hope you're excited about hearing from them as well and focusing on some of the issues, large and small, that you as the leaders of the future will have to go out and deal with in the world beyond these doors. Let's agree that there has never been a better time to be alive than right now. There's never been a better time to believe in flat earth theories. There has never been a better time to believe or to doubt the scientists when it comes to climate change. Never been a better time. And on the conspiracy theory espoused by QAnon supporters, I don't know if you're familiar with their idea about a cabal controlling the US government. There has never been a better time to be alive in terms of thinking about that. And I can assure you of that because if you checked your smartphones while you were outside in the break, you'll notice that Donald Trump in a town hall meeting has refused to disavow QAnon and their theories in a question and answer session in the US just in the last couple of hours. Of course, I am quoting from the New York Times. So do you trust them, the mainstream media? It is genuinely exciting to be with you to talk about some of the challenges and the difficulties and the opportunities in demonstrating leadership in a time when there is so much uncertainty in the world. And our panellists are very expert in doing that. So let's introduce them. Geez, I'd like to see their beaming faces. Am I going to see their beaming faces? Or are we going to be coming in down the line? Oh, there they are. There they are. Firstly, let's welcome her to the stage because she'll be sitting right in front of you as a local this morning. Let's welcome this afternoon. Everything I do is broadcast in the mornings when I've got a microphone, so forgive me. And forgive me, panel. Adie Delaney creates work in the intersection of her 3 roles. She's directing a community circus program. She teaches consent with a sexual harm prevention perspective and is a multidisciplinary artist. To be honest, she looks like she could cartwheel across the stage and into her chair this afternoon as well. She's been travelling the world since 2006 as a circus artist, been in Tasmania since 2015 when she founded the Circus School. She still pops up on stage as an aerialist, a storyteller, an actor and more, but in a different role. Performs as a primary prevention educator at Sexual Assault Support Service in Tasmania. And she says that she's not ruled out any possibilities when she grows up. Please welcome Adie Delaney to the stage. Adie, that's chair is for you. Let's say good afternoon to Shane Fitzsimmons. When people say, geez, hasn't 2020 got bad since COVID came along? Shane Fitzsimmons says, hold my beer. Shane, it's lovely to have you along. Shane is the Commissioner for Resilience New South Wales, and he joined that and took that role following more than 30 years of experience with the New South Wales Rural Fire Service as both a volunteer and a salaried officer. He's the chair of both the New South Wales State Emergency Management Committee and the New South Wales State Recovery Committee, and a councillor of the Royal Humane Society of New South Wales. Can I ask you please to welcome Shane Fitzsimmons? And our final guest this afternoon, Dean Parkin, is from the Quandamooka peoples of North Stradbroke Island in Queensland. He's a director of From the Heart, a campaign for an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament, protected by the Constitution. Dean was one of the people at the very centre of the Uluru Statement of the Heart that you will remember from 2017. I've done a rereading of it, preparing to talk with you today. Can I put it down on the list as required rereading for all of our guests here today and those watching online? It is an incredibly powerful document, but the challenges of managing trust that must have gone into building some sort of consensus to get that document amongst people who had every reason to lack trust. And then the hope to go out and build enough trust in the community to achieve the goals that are set out in that document. Again, really excited to be talking to Dean. Dean, can you give us a wave? Thank you so much for being part of what we're doing this afternoon. Shane, I want to start with you. Through late 2019 and the start of this year, one of your constituent audiences you were communicating with down the barrel of a camera. You were talking to the people of New South Wales as 6% of the state burned, 24 people tragically lost their lives, thousands of homes were lost. And you had to have a relationship that was conducted through press conference and down the barrel of a camera. Can I ask you please to talk about the mantras that you took into that experience to make sure that you maintained trust throughout all of those long months at the lectern?
Yeah, good afternoon and thanks, Leon. That's a really good question, and I would answer that by saying trust and confidence is critical in leadership, and particularly during crisis. And for me, there was two principal audience that I was always thinking about that I had in my mind during those conferences and during every visit we did in the field and whatever other communication we sent out. The first audience really centered around the extraordinary army of men and women that were dedicating themselves relentlessly, day after day, week after week, night after night, month after month, to try and serve and protect and save as many and as much as possible. So that workforce, their family and loved ones, and then of course, as you say, Leon, the community or the communities, plural, that were constantly under threat, that were being damaged, that were being devastated, that were being destroyed as a result of these fires, including those that lost their livelihoods, lost their businesses, lost their homes, lost everything they'd ever gathered in their life. And tragically, we saw too many lose loved ones, lose neighbours, lose friends. So they were my two principal audiences. But ultimately, though, whether it's crisis, and I think crisis really amplifies or magnifies the underlying culture of leadership that is in an organisation or an operation or inherent in a person. So the half a dozen things that I really tried to carry in as a mantra around leadership to build that trust, to build that confidence in communicating with those audiences and trying to bring the teams with us was really around authenticity as number one, keeping it real, being the real you and not sugarcoating what was otherwise really awful situations and circumstances and high-risk situations. So being clear, being authentic about who you are, what you knew, what you didn't know, and most importantly, what the circumstances were. Secondly, centres around humility and empathy. Remembering as leaders, and particularly in crisis, it's not about us, it's actually about everybody else. So that's really important. Mutual respect, courtesy, respect and regard for circumstances, opinions, backgrounds, diversity, all those sorts of things. The decisions being taken and the actions being implemented, knowing they were disrupting and disaffecting communities, but explaining those decisions and why they mattered was really important. And most of all, underpinning all that we were doing in that communication, in the roles we were undertaking, with a word that doesn't get used enough in leadership in my mind, is the word care, C-A-R-E. We have to genuinely care as leaders about our role, our function, our purpose, our teams, our colleagues, our bosses, our supervisors, and most importantly, as was the case in New South Wales, those we were relying on to get the job done, and the communities, the customers that were being impacted by those unprecedented events.
Shane, was there ever a moment in that journey, and this was a months-long journey of leading your team, was there ever a moment when you felt like the trust was slipping, there was a threat to that trust relationship? And if there was, would you be prepared to share that with us? And what, if anything, did you do to get that back?
No, so this campaign went on for many, many months, Leon. So people refer to it as the Black Summer Fires. You won't find me using that phrase because we were averaging more than 1,000 fires a month back in winter, June, July, August, and then it just built and built and built as the spring and summer months rolled on. But day after day, week after week, literally hundreds of consecutive days of bushfire emergencies in New South Wales and large-scale operations meant that we had to stick with the program. I think one of the things that was really quite deflating at times was when we thought we were gaining the upper hand, even though the weather forecast was problematic, it was just relentless in terms of above average temperatures and below average rainfall to constantly dominate the picture going forward. When we had days when we got down to only 40 or 50 fires, we thought we were making some really good progress, and we were sharing that with the community. But then we were all deflated. We were deflated as firefighters, we were deflated as emergency managers, and we were deflated as communities, because what would happen was dry lightning storms would move across the state, and within 12 hours to 24 hours, we'd go from 40 fires back to 165 fires in areas that weren't previously burned, or just outside control lines on fires that have been worked on literally for weeks and months. So they were the days where we were really focused on not losing the spirit, not losing the connectivity, not losing that connectedness with the workforce and with the communities that were under threat. And trying to reinforce that message and bring the teams with us was absolutely fundamental. But again, being really clear about what was unravelling, why it was unravelling, most importantly, what we were doing about it, but just as importantly, what we couldn't do about it or wouldn't be able to do about it given the circumstances, and therefore what was critical for people in harm's way to be doing to improve the prospects of survivability for them, their loved ones, and their property and homes.
Dean, we'll come to you in just a moment, but I want to focus on Adie Delaney to take us to the absolute other end of the spectrum for a moment. Imagine some of the roles that Adie sought in her leadership, trying to build trust with a sexual assault survivor or teaching somebody about that, where that young person might have every reason and important defence reasons not to trust. Can you take us now into the very individual tactics, the strategies that you use to build trust with individuals one-on-one in a relatively short period of time, Adie?
Yeah, absolutely. So normally I'm working with young people, but this applies to adults as well. I just want to make it clear that that's my perspective usually. And I really believe that trust is an inside job. You can't make someone trust you. It's really impossible. Same way you can't make someone feel safe. But what you can do is you can create a sense of trustworthiness around yourself. And you do that through things like safety, predictability, being reliable, being predictable, I think I already said. But things like that. So if a young child is disclosing to me of harm that something has happened to them, they've already decided that I'm trustworthy because of those things that I have exhibited. And then in response to that, maintaining that trustworthiness, and that is about ensuring that the child feels safe by regulating my own emotions. So I am stable and I am reliable and all of those things. I'm consistent in my messaging to them. I come from a place of belief and it's very validating. So it's pretty much everything that Shane was just talking about on an interpersonal scale. And we've heard a lot today in this conference about transparency, and that is really, really vital, particularly for survivors of abuse who are dealing with layers upon layers of shame and stigma and so many reasons why they haven't spoken up about it before, or maybe they have and they haven't been believed. So for me, it's really, really important that there's transparency in their decision making. So particularly for survivors who are children, there's mandatory reporting requirements. So there's a lot of fear around that. And I will say to a child, this sounds really important, and I just want you to know that I'm probably going to have to talk to another grown-up about this. And then they get agency from that, because the other side of trustworthiness is empowerment. So you can be as trustworthy as you like, and that's great, but if you have to empower the people or person to be able to speak up, to be able to ask questions, to be able to feel like they have choice in part of that decision-making process. And for example, for a child who's disclosed abuse and I need to make a mandatory report, I'll say to them, do you want to come with me? Do you want to hear me talk on the phone to the people so that you can hear what I can say? And no, we don't have to tell your parents straight away. That might happen in the future, but we'll always make sure that it's in your best interest and that you're with someone that you feel safe if you don't feel safe around your parents. all of this explicit kind of language, which is what Shane was talking about, like keeping the community abreast of what's happening in that situation. I'm keeping a child informed of the processes that need to happen.
So what have you worked on in yourself as a professional over the years to improve your skills, your ability to do that and to do that well?
To be trustworthy?
Yeah, to be trustworthy, or the skills, the foundation skills that actually underpin that.
The first step was learning to trust myself. And that's a longer conversation and something that Circus taught me. It was a really slow, long process, but I learned to listen to my own body. We all have, and again, it's been discussed today, we've talked about instincts and those intuitive feelings. And we do, as biological human animals, still have a connection to our amygdala, the lizard part of our brain, that when it perceives threat, will activate to keep us safe, and it will either fight, flight, or freeze are the three main ones, which I'm sure you've heard of. And we can get those visceral sensations in our body, which are usually associated with fear. So as a trapeze artist, I'm very familiar with those because I stand on high things and I enjoy jumping off them. And of course, it can be part of the fun. We like to feel, you know, we go on roller coasters, we watch horror movies because we like that increased heart rate, that tension across our chest, a little bit hot in the face. Some of those things I'm feeling right now. My heart rate is actually a little bit up. So getting in touch with them and being in a space where that doesn't overtake my logic brain. So I can stay engaged up here and go, okay, I am 12 meters up, I am only holding onto a hand loop, and I'm trusting the other person over there that they've got me, and I'm about to jump off, and this is really quite intense what's going on here, but I do still want to do this, and I feel confident that I will not hurt myself. So, yep, let's go. Woohoo, super fun. So
you're talking about training your own trust and instincts.
Yeah, and it's something we can do through sport, through activity, all those things. But like I said, that's trustworthiness. That's getting to know your own thing. And so what Circus actually didn't teach me, and what I learned through the Sexual Assault Support Service, is that I needed to be empowered by other people to communicate my decisions and my choice. So sure, you can be feeling those stress responses, but unless someone is giving you the space and time to say, I don't feel comfortable about this, I don't want to do this yet, then that's not going to be a trusting relationship.
Thank you for that. Dean Parkin, let's come to you now. I was thinking in preparing for our chat about the challenge that you had in front of you in bringing people together for what ultimately became a huge forum requiring an enormous amount of trust from people who might reasonably not have been expected not to have too much trust, that ended up in becoming the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I wonder if you can talk to us about how you started to build the trust for people to come together and take the chances that led to that document and the hopes that flowed from it.
Sure, thanks, Leon. Before I do that, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm standing on the lands of the Gimwe, Wallabara, Yidinji and Yiddiganji people up here in Cairns, and I do pay my respects to their elders past and present. It was an extremely involved, very complex, very emotionally and intellectually challenging process to be part of with the referendum council dialogue process. And as you say, building that trust from people who have every right to distrust systems and processes that have served to oppress in many cases and dispossess, as we all know. I think the first thing that was really important going into the process, looking at each other as team members starting out, was having core belief that the cause was right, that this was the right cause to be part of, that this was something that we all believed in our heart of hearts, because we knew later on down the track when we were dealing with different groups and different dynamics in different places that would be challenged. So we needed to be able to look each other in the eye before we even started and said, you know, this is something that this is all something that we believe in. Preparation was really, really important. I'm generally a person that likes to fly by the seat of the pants a little bit. and make it up as we go. I'm curious in that way, but in this context, preparation was just critically important. We did a lot of groundwork. We held 3 workshops before we even started the dialogues, going around talking to different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about how they thought the process should work, what were the key criteria, how should people be selected, how do you have the conversations, how do we listen well, how do we set it up. So the preparation allowed us then to build a really strong and robust process. And it needed to be consistent. It needed to be a process that we could stand by with integrity, that was transparent, and that could be applied in different places, because we wanted to be able to give every single region, the 13 regions that we engaged with, the opportunity to engage in this process on fair and equal sort of terms. So that process was critically important. And then when you're in it, when you're delivering, having done the preparation, having established the process, it's this really fine balance between utter conviction that the process is robust and comes from a place of research and is informed, and this sense of intuition of being able to feel and read the room as you go through and say, well, what do we need to do to flex and change and adapt to respond to what was actually happening? Because you can build all the processes in the world and all the structures in the world, but fundamentally it still comes down to people. And in our context and the issues that we were talking about, things that generated enormous amounts of emotion, both positive and sometimes challenging. So, and it's a real grey area. This idea of having strong conviction that what you're doing is right and the process is good, to then also just pick up how do we adapt and flex that with literally what people are telling us as we stand there in the room. So those elements, and I'll pick up a point that Shane talked about too, about humility. Absolutely, we were in service to the people that were in the room, but we were also in service to the generations that had come before us. This is not a new thing that we're talking about here. Generations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been talking about these issues. So there's a degree of comfort, actually, of there's obviously responsibility to do that well in my time of custodianship, but also knowing that I'm not alone and I come from a heritage of people that have been talking about these things, and also knowing that what we're doing is about helping create the conditions and the environment for those that are yet to come. So, yeah.
What did you learn on the journey? I've alluded to this with both of the other panellists this afternoon. What did you learn about having difficult conversations through this? Shane touched on it earlier. You need to be honest. People came to that meeting with very different views about what they regarded as success. Was that mandatory numbers of parliamentarians? Was it a constitutional recognition? Was it something else? Were we going far enough? And if we didn't go as far as I wanted, then was it worth being here at all? You had to have those difficult conversations, manage that expectation and maintain trust. Can you give our leaders here in Tasmania some lessons that you took from that, please?
I think in having those challenging conversations, the single most important thing is not about what you say, but it is about how you listen. It's not actually about what you've got to say as the person that's in that space stepping onto their country, into their lives. It's about the way that you listen and the way that you actually reflect back to people and check with them and tell them and ask them, have I listened well? Has what you've said, have I captured that? And I actually had a job. My job in the room was to live capture on a whiteboard, like a mind mapping, spider diagramming, hour-long plenary sessions and capturing everything that people had said. And I was able, through a technique I've sort of built up over a few years, to be able to name the person and check with them in front of 100 people on the floor, did I hear you properly? Did we actually capture that properly? In your own words, not in my words. So that deep listening is the most important part of the conversation.
Let's move the conversation on now to what happens when things become political. I spoke humorously at what I hope was humorously at the start of our panel. Nowadays so much becomes political. The response to COVID, mask wearing, in the US, Democrats wear masks, Republicans don't. On the issue of climate change, there is a perception somehow that this is a political issue. Shane Fitzsimmons, what happens when it gets political, when there's politics swirling all around you. When people want to make your press conference each day about the story of climate change, if somebody felt you was under political pressure to be seen to be doing things and might have flown back from Hawaii and wanted photo opportunities with you, and you found yourself being hugged uncomfortably, how did you maintain, because our audience, I mean, almost every grant that our leaders here receive will somehow be tied to some political hope of, of recognition. So let's talk about it on the big stage where you were doing it. How do you manage the politics as a leader serving the community? How did you do that?
Look, it's a really good question, Leon, and I would preface my answer by saying I'm not aware of anything that happens in our lives where there isn't some politics, and what I mean by that is the little p politics and the big P politics. So we've got what happens in our business, in our private lives, but also we've got what happens with our elected leaders. But for me, particularly during crisis, as I do during the conduct of business, you've got to maintain candour and focus, that authenticity about what's real and what's not. I think it's important to call out what is not right and what is not true. And I did that a number of times during press conferences, and where there was speculation, where there was innuendo, I was pretty direct in saying that isn't the case. And I literally said, put up or shut up. Our focus here is on the people of New South Wales, is on the tragedy that's unfolding, on the very risk that's unfolding. There are people's lives at threat here. Let's keep focused. And you're right, climate change was a classic example. And unfortunately, the debate tends to be, you've got the loonies on the left, you've got the crazies on the right, and no one's having the sensible conversation in the middle. So when it comes to things like fires and fire behaviour and what that means in changing seasonalities and all those sorts of things, there is a discussion, there is a debate. Keeping it factual, keeping it focused and keeping it impartial is absolutely the focus in leadership, particularly where that leadership is being tested during crises and there is opportunism and people coming to the fore to leverage off that crisis, is making sure we don't get distracted and that we encourage everybody that's part of the team, our political masters, to make sure we focus on the task at hand and not the nonsense on the side.
What do you do and say when, off the back of these fires, I identify as a politician a photo op? I'm going to hand you 50 new trucks. I want you there for the photo because you've got brand. What do you say and do for our leaders of the future to draw on, to stay out of that ruck? And how do you manage the possible consequences of doing that?
So as a public servant, you are loyal to the government of the day. But what I would also say is, in my time as Commissioner of the Rural Fire Service, I think I reported to 9 different ministers and about 5 or 6 different premiers. I would be very confident in saying that my bosses, those political masters over that last decade or more, would be very open in saying they never left a room, or I never left a room, talking about an issue, talking about a policy, talking about a strategy, talking about an announcement, where they didn't leave the room knowing what was on my mind and my views on that point of view, that views on that matter, no matter that being negative or positive or supportive or otherwise. It is absolutely critical that we have our governments and our politicians understanding our business, understanding priorities, and being part of the prosecution of the case to secure budgets, to secure fundings, to modify strategy and programs to address those emerging issues, to address the risks, to address the limitations or the gaps in the organisation or the policy remit. So working very closely and tying in very neatly with our politicians is absolutely fundamental. And contrary in the last decade or so to some of my colleagues around the country, one of the first things I did when we led this unprecedented fire campaign was talk to the minister and have him and his team located in the State Operations Centre. And as things escalated, we had the Premier and her team do exactly the same thing. They needed to be there. They needed to understand what these what these decisions that were being taken that had big implications for societal functioning, movement of people, dislocation of people. They needed to understand why those decisions were being taken, what the criticality was, and what the alternatives might have been, which often wasn't very much. So having them understand and be part of the problem, absolutely critical to buying into being able to deliver the best whole of government effort possible.
Dean Parkin, can I come back to you for a moment and think about the politics around that will inevitably attach itself to what it was that came out of the Uluru Statement from the Heart? I mean, inevitably now there was a political process to follow for constitutional recognition. You built enough trust to come up with this powerful document, but then a new journey of trust starts. Can I ask you about how you're thinking about that trust, about building that trust, about taking this into the political realm where constitutional reform will need to be argued? What are you your thinking about there?
Yeah, I think it's a question we're wrestling with all the time, and part of the unique challenge I think for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our own country is the reality is we're an extreme minority. We're less than 3% of the population, and so anything that we have to do, as Shane said, is inherently political. We have to try and find leverage somewhere in the system to help bring the 97% along on the journey. So that's always starting from a pretty challenging perspective. There's a whole bunch of things that can appeal to people in terms of navigating through the politics. We can appeal to the legal correctness and the legal robustness, if you like, of the proposals that came out of Uluru. We can talk to the past, and we can talk to the moral urgency that's needed to address the issues, so to speak, to close the gap for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. But I think what really animates people is connection to story and connection to vision. And if we can actually connect everyday Australians to the story and vision of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, we can connect them to the essence, and that's something that people will want to get involved in. And I can speak to that, I can testify to that, having spent the last 3 and a bit years since Uluru talking to thousands of people across the country. All of the technicalities of it, they're not actually so important as saying, you've been invited to be part of this journey, you've been invited to be part of this story. Their invitation is sitting there on the table for you right now, and everybody that's sitting in the room actually has that invitation sitting before them right now to join with us in this movement. And I think that's the thing that inspires people. I think that's the thing that will help. The politics will be there. Let's just not be naive about that. The way we're going to do that is give hope and vision and connect people to that.
I want to spend a moment now talking about the trust that you need to have within yourself to be a good leader, and we touched on it. A little while ago. Adie, as you are asking people to do things where inevitably they're going to have to crash to get better at it, how do you trust yourself to ask them to do those sorts of things? As leaders, you will be asking people to go out and take on tasks that they may or may not be equipped for. I think you talked about it a little bit earlier today as one of your sessions. Adie, how do you manage that in yourself, trusting yourself to ask a kid to do a backflip that may end up on in the wall, but is inevitably part of the process?
Yeah, the prerequisite for me is that they have a voice. So it is about empowering them to make sure that they're going to tell me if they don't feel comfortable. And sometimes that's me looking at them and going, you look a little nervous. Are you sure about this? Or would you like me to spot you? You know, that'll just mean that I'm going to hold you around your hips and I'm going to help your leg do this. Or would you like an extra crash mat, or do you want to try it on a lower trapeze first before you try it on a higher trapeze? So giving options and ensuring that I'm asking a question that they have to respond to, so I'm not essentially bullying them into doing something that they are not ready for. But also I'm pretty good at reading body language.
Yeah. Shane, can I take that back to you in your experiences managing organisations that comprise thousands of people? Can I ask you about that personal journey of trusting individuals and how you approach it? As Adie's encouraging somebody to do their first giant swing, how do you think about encouraging the people working around you, underneath you, to take that chance and to put your trust in them?
And leveraging off what Adie just said there, when you're outside the one-on-one, and as leaders at whatever level, you've still got those lots of one-on-one interactions, which are really, really important. But stemming from the principles that Adie just talked about, it's actually about a cultural appreciation of empowering and instilling trust that we've got training, we've got the best systems, we've got the best programs, we've got the best investments going on, but they all centre around people being able to do their part. So your investment in training, your investment in empowerment, your ability to put confidence into them being able to exercise initiative, take actions, make decisions, knowing that they're going to be doing it with the confidence of the backing of the leadership, of the backing of the organisation, particularly where those decisions and actions are made with sound intent. They're being made also during crisis with very limited windows of opportunity for contemplation and procrastination. You've got to make decisions in a very timely, quick time, often, with very limited information, but doing nothing is no option. You're talking about literally, in many cases, life and death decisions, and you've got to back them in. And I think culture is fundamental, that people have got to build that confidence and build that trust in. If they're making the decisions that they genuinely believe are right and things go wrong, management's going to be there to back them in, not haul them over the coals. And in that context, particularly in crisis, and we saw it with the tragedy during this fire season, and we saw it where a number of strategies just didn't go to plan because of an unseen variable or an unexpected weather event or something. That's where leaders really need to stand up, be present, be accountable, and take responsibility for that on behalf of their team, to make sure that the team's got confidence. If they're doing the right thing and they're generally trying to do the right thing, they can go ahead and do it. Don't get me wrong, if you find somebody that does it once and then does it a second or third time, that's a different story, and you've got to deal with that separately. But you've got to empower people to be able to have the confidence to make those decisions and know that their leaders are going to back them, particularly when they've done it with absolutely sound intent.
Let's go around the room and get some top tips for saying, I got it wrong. So often now we're used to passing apologies as, if you were offended, I apologise. Well, that's not really an apology. It's an apology if you were offended. Let's talk about and provide some feedback on top tips from Dean, Adie and Shane about how to properly take responsibility for something that, with the best intent, didn't go to plan. Adie, your top tips, please, for how do you approach saying, I got it wrong?
Thanks. I want to avoid your question for just 1 second and add on to what Shane said, because it also ties into what Dean was saying before about listening well, because that doesn't mean once you've empowered people to speak up that you just accept everything that they're saying and that they're right every time, because that's incorrect. And as a leader, you're likely to be mentoring these people. And obviously I'm talking again about young people, which is my area where I work. So either way, if a young child speaks up, I'm always going to thank them for doing that. I'm going to be like, thank you so much for bringing this to my attention. I really appreciate you opening up to me. Or, that's a really good point. I completely disagree with you and we're not going to do that today, but thanks for bringing it up. So I do get it wrong. I do get it wrong all the time. And that often comes up in the context of me not being in another person's body. Stick with me. So it's about, like I said at the start, trust is an inside job, feeling safe is an inside job. So I can put someone on a trapeze and I can say, you're completely safe. This trapeze is made of steel, it's made of load-rated rope that's 1 ton on either side, so you would have to put a car on this trapeze to make it break. You're holding on with your knees and your hands, you can't fall off. Doesn't matter what I say, that person is going to feel safe or they're not going to feel safe. And if they don't feel safe, I can't say, you're safe, you feel safe, because that's their experience of the moment. We all perceive threat differently. So for me, who loves heights, I was the only sibling in growing up that had to wear a leash because I used to run to cliffs. But other people get 2 rungs up a ladder and they're having panic attacks. So where I've been wrong has come because I've been like, oh, you're safe, it's fine. And then I'm like, actually, no, they're having a completely different experience. And I usually just back it up explicitly. And I'm like, I'm so sorry, I made an assumption there. Would you like to change this situation? Tell me what you're feeling. I also, spotting people on trapezes and things, sometimes a hand slips and you grab a breast. And you're like, I'm so sorry, that was completely unintentional, are you okay? Won't happen again, moving on. Gaffes like that, but certainly more than willing and more than happy to name up what I did, apologise and move on.
So pushing yourself as a leader to make sure you think, oh, I'm going to let this slide, it'll be forgotten in 5 minutes, and rather actually making sure as a leader you step up and confront it to preserve
well,
trust?
that's the behaviour that I want to see from the people that I'm mentoring. So I have to walk the walk.
Dean, can I come to you, please? The advice that you would have in terms of, we talk about vulnerability and making sure that we're showing that we're human and listening. So the advice that you bring to our panel this afternoon about how to take responsibility well as a leader in the many areas of expertise that you bring to this conversation.
I'd probably say two things. One is it's about integrity, and I don't mean that just as a kind of tagline or a sort of bureaucratic term. I mean the day-to-day, the moment-to-moment demonstrated examples of your own personal integrity. It doesn't really matter how you say you got that wrong or you want to apologise. It depends on how that person sees you going into that and whether they believe you. It's not going to be about the words. It's going to be about whether they fundamentally believe that when you own up to something, you can just look them in the eye and they know. So I think it's about building that over time. And you can't hide from that. There's no shortcut to it. You can't turn it on and off. It's the moment that you have in the tea room when you're saying hello to somebody, bumping into the lift on the way into the office, as well as those big key, Churchillian moments as a leader that you've got to do that people believe. And the other thing I'd say is one of the things I've had to learn what to do is be gentle with myself and taking responsibility of those things too. If you place a really, really high level of expectation on yourself to get it right all the time, I can fall into the trap of punishing myself pretty badly for falling short of those standards. So I think it's about being honest and acting with integrity, and that determines how people receive it, and then finding those moments and just say it's okay, you can bugger up every now and then too.
Shane, your thoughts and advice on on taking responsibility, on apologising, on accepting responsibility. What is it to do it well in an organisation to maintain trust?
Look, it's interesting. Two things I would say, picking up on what Adie and Dean said. I'm more concerned about the people that never make mistakes or the people that claim they've never made a mistake, because it signals to me they're probably doing bugger all. So they're not having a go. They're not leading anything. They're not exercising initiative. They're not seeking to do betterment. So that's the bit of a cynic in me. So if someone says they've never made a mistake, I'm really very wary. But we had some pretty significant events that unfolded during the last bushfire season here in New South Wales, and one of the most significant was very difficult task of backburning, lighting fires to put the main fire front out. And it goes over many kilometres, over many days and weeks. And we were doing it up through the back end of the Blue Mountains. And there was one particular burn that was implemented. It was going very well. And then suddenly there was this extraordinary flare-up because of an unforecast, unrealised weather event that resulted in this backburn escaping, becoming a new fire front, destroying quite a number of homes and extending this fire enormously. Now, I know, because I was involved in the planning and seeing what the local teams were promoting and suggesting as the continuance of the strategy, the analysis and the contemplation and the risk evaluation and the alternatives was absolutely sound. But what happened on that day was a localised weather event that was not in any detailed forecast materialised and actually flared the fire up and ran in a different direction. There was an extraordinary level of interest in that. So in terms of apologising to the community and being very clear to the community, it was adopting those principles that Dean and Adie and myself have been talking about in this panel session. Being authentic, owning the issue, being really clear and honest about what happened, why we think it happened, what's now unfolded, some context, owning it and saying very publicly, this is something that happened. And I think being able to, as Dean said, identify some stories and connections. Some of the leaders of this activity had damage to their own homes and lost their own homes. Does anyone seriously think they were going out there trying to do this work, knowing that it would destroy their own community? No, it wasn't. But being very open, being very honest and being transparent about what we knew at the time, what we didn't know at the time, and what had gone wrong helps with that explanation, helps with that ownership at the highest levels of the organisation when things go seriously wrong, because our teams on the front line, if they're not saving everyone and everything, they already feel bad enough. But if the particular activity that they've undertaken has contributed to that damage, then it's devastating for them. So we've got to back them in and we've got to support them.
I'm wondering if you can start preparing some questions for the floor, please, for our audience, for our guests about trust. Will I have some questions from the floor? People are going to put their hands up, and I'll run out to you with a microphone so that we can draw on some more of the experience from your perspective, from our guests this afternoon. I feel like I should tell you the time and do a station ID, so excuse me for that. But yeah, I'm sure you'd love to ask some questions of our guests this afternoon. So can I ask who's got a question for me? Up the back. Just excuse me, panel, I'm just taking off and heading up the back to get a question from Ange Driver.
Hi, panel. Thank you so much for your time today. I've got a question from Beck Greenwood, who's attending online, and it's a question particularly for Shane around asking whether it's getting harder for those in the public service to provide frank and fearless advice to political advisors as they are perhaps becoming more powerful.
It's an interesting question. Shane, to you, is it getting harder to provide frank and fearless advice as a public servant, as political advisors get more powerful?
My simple answer to that question is no. And as I do with my teams, as I do with my political masters, as I have always done internally and politically with our advisors, frank and fearless advice is fundamental to establishing a relationship of trust and a relationship that's professional. I think I've seen and witnessed firsthand where public servants have tried to interpret what their political master might want to hear, and then that challenges your ability to give frank and fearless advice, which is where you end up getting tied up. Don't get me wrong, providing frank and fearless advice is one thing. Whether that's accepted or not is another thing. But ultimately, if the government, or the minister determines to go down a particular strategy, notwithstanding the advice that you've provided that might be cautionary or negative to that strategy, ultimately we are loyal to the government of the day. If they decide to go down a particular path with the strategy, then we serve the government in seeking to implement that strategy. So to me, I've never been hesitant in providing frank and fearless advice in business times, and particularly during crisis times, about the reality of what's unfolding and what needs to be done.
Thank you for the answer. Dean Parkin, can I ask you before we take our next question, what are you doing at the moment to try and build trust within government and across Parliament to find action for the action that is called for in the Uluru Statement from the Heart?
Yeah, good question. We're trying to keep our agenda high on the agenda as much as we possibly can, which is always a bit of a challenge. I think the other thing we absolutely refer back to is the founding of the Uluru Statement from the Heart at the beginning, which was that it was a non-partisan open invitation for all people to participate in this, and that's the way that we've carried that ethos through in the way that we've prosecuted the campaign ever since. And I think we're just trying to find areas of commonality. We can always get focused on where we're getting blocked or where the challenges are coming in terms of political responses to things like the Uluru Statement. I think it's better in some cases to start from where do you agree with us? Where are the absolute easy wins, the no-brainers on this? Okay, great. Let's bank those. Let's bank those and then work our way through as we go up the scale of complexity and I guess division in terms of our respective positions. So yeah, let's focus on the things that we can agree on and get behind, and then prepare ourselves for the challenges down the road where we're going to have to potentially adopt different strategies to win the argument.
Thank you for that. Let's go to Sue Ellen, who's got a question. Sue Ellen, your question, please.
Yeah, I'm just picking up on something that Shane said before about being present. And I'm wondering, in moments where, you've got different political masters, you've got communities that you're serving, and this goes for all the panel members, how do you kind of quieten down some of that noise to be present with the people that you're serving and that need your time and attention in that moment?
Shane, to you.
So my simple answer to that is, as leaders at all levels, we've got to understand how to juggle our reporting and our accountability responsibilities up the line. But at the end of the day, we are nothing as leaders if we don't have our teams. And as someone who's been part of a volunteer organisation for a long time, 70-odd thousand volunteers, 99% of the entire agency was volunteer, 1% staff. The worst of tragedies happened during the fire seasons, and a number of them. We had not just the 26 lives lost in New South Wales, but in those 26 lives lost, we had 4 volunteer firefighters and we had 3 aircrew. And the minute I got insights into intelligence coming through about tragedy on the fire line, no matter what was going on, I just advised my political masters. My deputy just stood in and took over the full operation of the control room, and my whole mission was to get out to that accident scene, was to catch up with the crews that were involved in those fatal accidents. 2 people died when a tree crashed through the windscreen. Another person died when the truck was flipped over by an extraordinary weather event, and another fellow died when his vehicle rolled over on the way back from the fire ground, and another 3 aircrew died when their plane crashed. But getting down onto that scene, counselling, debriefing, spending time with crews was absolutely fundamental. As a matter of fact, when those things happened, they happened late at night. We didn't go to bed that night, and we fronted up the next morning straight away for press conferences to talk about what was happening. Once we finished with the crews in the field, we then went back to the families, to the homes and to see the wives, to see the toddlers, to see the mums and dads, the brothers, spend time with them talking about, again, that authenticity, that truthfulness, that building of trust about what we know had happened, what we're not certain about yet of what have happened, and most importantly, what we're going to do to support that family. It is absolutely the most difficult leadership responsibility in my decades of experience, but it was also some of the most sacred, the most significant, and the most special that I will never forget in my life, to have families open their doors and welcome you in and allow you to be part of that grieving process and part of that journey outside the worst moment in their life. That's what about leadership being present in my mind's all about. Without people, you've got nothing. And I've got to say, every political leader I've ever had, the political leaders I've had during this fire season, they all completely get that. But it's about being authentic and knowing when it is right to prioritise and move and drop everything to focus on what really matters, particularly when things go wrong. And leaders need to be there when things go wrong, absolutely more than they need to be there for celebratory times. Let the team celebrate, but by crikeys, you make sure you're there when things are at their worst and you're standing up and owning where things have gone wrong.
Thank you for that. Susan, your question, please.
What is the greatest personal challenge you've had to lean into to grow yourself as a leader?
Let's throw that around the panel. Yeah. Adie, we'll start with you. What's the greatest personal challenge you've had to grow as a leader?
That's a hard question. Sorry, not sorry. The hardest challenge to grow as a leader. Does anyone else have any immediate insights?
Dean, do you want to pick this up and run with it? What's the hardest personal challenge?
I'll give it a go.
Inspire me, Dean.
This is going to sound a little bit counterintuitive, so just bear with me. The biggest challenge I had imposter syndrome big time for a long, long time. I thought that I was fooling absolutely everyone. I thought I was fooling people close to me. I thought I was fooling my mentors. I thought I was fooling the people that I worked with. That ultimately, at some stage, the whole facade would come crashing down, and they'd realise I was a fraud that was pretending. And I lived with this for quite a long time. And it took a level of humility for me to realise that there are actually some wonderful people that are around me, some brilliant, emotionally connected people that were telling me otherwise and were believing in me and backing me. And I had to stop for a moment and realise, do I think I'm actually that good in my deception and this imposter syndrome that I can fool that person and that person and that person and that person? Then I realised there's a fair bit of negative ego playing there at that point in time that I had to just get over and put aside. So that was probably the biggest one for me, to actually say, no, you are good. You're learning and you'll make mistakes still, but fundamentally at the core of it, you are good, and what you do is valuable.
Shane?
In a similar way, Leon, very similar to what Dean just talked about, and I remember it very vividly. It was a really confronting set of circumstances for me. I grew up in a male-dominated organisation. I grew up in an era where men were men, blokes were blokes. and we didn't shed emotion. We didn't have to have tears. And I remember when I was leading, some awful fires in New South Wales 7 years ago, back in October 2013, we did a press conference, and there was this. I was overwhelmed by the emotion of what was going on, and I welled up and I lost my words, and I was quite emotional at a press conference. I was standing there with the Premier and the Minister, and just as Dean said, it was so hypocritical to what I preached, to what I believed in, to what I asked others to do, that I found myself, and I viewed myself as a complete failure because I'd allowed the emotion of what was an extraordinary event unfolding at the time get the better of me, and I wasn't strong, and I wasn't resolute, and I wasn't firm and authoritative, and all those sorts of things, which was right against my fundamental beliefs of being authentic and being compassionate and having humility and being vulnerable and connecting and relating to people when things aren't going well, when things are difficult, when things are traumatic, that it's okay to be affected, that it's okay to look at that with sadness, to look at that with despair. And so for me, that was a real turning point for me, and I love the word fraud, Dean. I found myself being really hypocritical to all that I was preaching and asking of others, that I was still deep down, because of my upbringing and the institutionalised nature of being strong and learning from my predecessors and all those other male figures that stood up, that our place wasn't to get emotional even when things were really tough. And deep down, I'm a pretty bloody emotional sort of person, to be honest, hopeless in movies and hopeless in funerals and all those sorts of things. But it's okay to be vulnerable when you've got enormous confronting, tragic crises unfolding in front of you, particularly when they're on your watch, if I can say that.
Yeah.
That's really beautiful, Shane. Thank you so much for sharing. And so important to have role models that are male and in positions of power speaking openly and honestly about this stuff. So thank you. And Dean, as well, I think everybody can relate to imposter syndrome. You're not alone. I think we've all experienced some level of that challenge, but you're great.
Thank you. You're not too bad either.
We had a really interesting story last year. It's the 12-month anniversary of a story where Rachel Power, who was a member of the Derwent Valley Council, came on the program and announced that she was going to resign from council, and she was talking about the toll that social media bullying had had on her life, and she just didn't want to put up with it anymore. And she chose to resign publicly so that she took the power away from if she'd resigned quietly, the trolls would have won. She did it, and it became a national story. The next day, Wayne Johnson, the mayor of Meander Valley Council, was on the radio, and he started crying as he talked about the toll that social media bullying was having on him. And he sent me a text afterwards, and excuse my French, but he said, "Sorry, I am such a soft cock. I feel terrible that I cried on air." And I called him straight away and said, "Wayne, that is the power of the story, and the impact that it's having on you is what made that story, part of what made that story travel around the country and see reforms instituted in local government to better support." And Danny Gibson is here somewhere. He might well understand that there's been some more work done to understand because of that. But it's not because of necessarily what he said, but what he demonstrated he was feeling. That was a big part of that
Can I
story.
just respond to that before we take the next question? Because I think it is really, really important, and that story shows how important it is. And I want to call out what just happened in the room is that when you mentioned the text that he had sent, there was a ripple of laughter that went around, because that's still how we view male emotional response.
It's how he viewed it, his own. That's what he was beating himself up after the call.
And we collectively as a room played into that. So I just want to name up that happened, and I just, maybe a bit of self-inflection, introspection.
Might I be able to add one more thing, Leon? Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've just had the most traumatic fire season, unprecedented in New South Wales, and people have been tremendously affected. I got to say, one of the most concerning and disturbing phone calls I had was only a matter of weeks ago, where I caught up with one of my colleagues in the RFS, And it was a late night conversation. We were reflecting on a couple of events that I think we were hitting an anniversary milestone of the 12 months. And it was an emotional conversation. It was a private conversation on both sides of the telephone. And he talked about he'd reached a point where he was getting professional support and assistance in dealing with how he was feeling and how he was coming out of the fire season. And I reflected on how proud I was of the fact that he was doing it. But the most disturbing and concerning aspect of the phone conversation was that he pleaded with me not to let anybody know that he was doing it. And I thought, crikey, is this still where we're at? That this stigma is around, that we are not comfortable enough saying, you know, if we bust our leg, we're happy to go and get medical treatment and put a plaster cast on it and hobble around, you know, for 6 weeks or whatever it is. What's wrong with getting some support and seeking some assistance to help us through the healing and repair journey that comes with the emotional and psychological well-being of the most profound and confronting and tragic of circumstances that might unfold in our lives. I mean, we've got to do something individually and collectively about this challenge.
We must accept our vulnerabilities. We have to. It's so important. Yeah, thank you.
So as leaders, it's critical then when somebody shares a vulnerability with you that you get on board and you show them that you will back them. As you said earlier, you don't always have to agree. You can agree or disagree, but when that vulnerability gets shown, you have to show them that you'll walk with them through that and walk with them through it in front of other people and support them all the way through. Look, I'm mindful of the fact that we've got time. I can't see Ange and whether she's tapping her wrist at me furiously, but I suspect that we're coming to the end of this session. I look forward to it all week with a reason. Dean, can I thank you sincerely for your participation in this. And Dean, I want you to do an ad now, if you wouldn't mind. You've got the Tasmania's young leaders in front of you. I want you to give us a pep talk, please, before we go, about what we can do as Tasmanians and play our role in supporting a push for Indigenous recognition in Australia's Constitution. What can our leaders do? How can they lead when it comes to the story that you've been central to here this afternoon?
Two things. Thanks, Leon. I'll make the best use of the plug. Two things. Firstly and foremostly, remember that the Uluru Statement is an invitation to every single one of you. It wasn't a submission to government. It wasn't a petition. It wasn't a plea to government. It was an invitation to the Australian people to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. So it's up to you to decide what your response is going to be. And obviously, we'd like you to join with us in this movement and support the Uluru Statement and the push for a voice to Parliament enabled by the Constitution. So the thing that you can do that is fromtheheart.com.au, campaign website. Have a look there. It's got lots of information. It's got ideas about how you can be involved, follow our social media from there. And we're going to build this person by person, story by story. So join with us. And I look forward to walking on that journey with you.
Dean, thank you so much for being part of the forum as part of the Tasmanian Leaders Program. Adie, thank you so much to you for being part of it and bringing your experience to the panel this afternoon as well.
Such a pleasure.
And Shane, thank you to you as well from New South Wales. So thank you to all of you for being part of the panel. Can I ask you please, whether you're online, clap in front of the screen, or whether you're here to give our guests a round of applause. Thanks very much. I'll hand you back now to Roz, and we'll get ready to wrap up your Tas Leaders Program exercise in trust over the last couple of days. Thank you all.